Up here. I hope that this has been encouraging for you as we've gone through these lessons. The goal has been to hopefully give you some context for how we got where we are, and also equip you somewhat to be able to navigate all the political chaos that's happening. I want to read something here. I was thinking about this today, and in Peter's letters to the churches, he, in the first several centuries of the church, the primary persecutors of Christians were Jews. They weren't Romans. Rome thought that Christianity was just another sect of Judaism because you have all these different groups who were vying for political power. You had the Essenes, and you had the Zealots, and you had the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and all these people. And so from Rome's perspective, everybody was a Jew. And then Christians started to convert Gentiles into the faith. And the primary stress with the Roman Empire was actually economic, because you had this whole micro economy that were selling idols, these silver or different material made idols, and the idol trade was very lucrative. And so as Gentiles became believers, they stopped buying these idols. And so the Roman idol makers started to petition their governing authority, saying, we're losing business, and as a result, we're losing tax revenue. And then you have the identity of, to be Roman means to worship these gods, and if we're not worshiping these gods, then we're not Romans, and you have this whole big thing starting to develop. So as persecution begins to unfold, it transitions from the Jews persecuting Christians to now we have the state persecuting Christians. And you kind of have a double whammy. So if you go through and you read, so Peter is obviously a prominent figure in the early church, but he was very prominent in the Jewish side of Christianity because of his ministry in Palestine. And so was Jesus' half-brother, James. So if you read, for instance, the book of James is the very first epistle that was ever written in the New Testament. So what happens is Herod Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great, he starts persecuting Christians. He kills James, the brother of John. That's the John that ends up in the island of Patmos. And I can't remember where this is. This is like Acts chapter 17, I think, something like that, 11, 12. Anyway, but so Herod grew up with a Roman soon-to-be Caesar named Caligula, and so he realizes that, Rome kind of likes this when I persecute these Christians. And so he starts really bearing down on the Christians in Jerusalem, and so they scatter. And so all of these Jewish Christians are trying to find refuge in these little towns around Palestine in other Christian communities, and they're getting turned away. So James sits down. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He's a logical author for this letter, and he pens this letter, and he basically chastises these believers for not seeing their brothers and sisters who were in need and not taking them in. And so there's a lot of language in the book of James about being a doer of the word and not a hearer only, and making sure that your faith has works and not just this theoretical idea. So anyway, you have all of this conflict between the government. And so Peter, as he's finishing his ministry, he writes this series of letters to the churches, and since he's such a prominent Jewish scholar on the Jewish side of Christianity, his Jewish audience really pays attention when he speaks. So in the first letter that he writes, 1 Peter, in chapter 2, he calls them to be a united people, and also to remember, he's talking to all Christians, but he does speak a lot to Jewish Christians. He's talking about how they should see the governing authorities. And he says this in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. He says, "Submit to every human authority because of the Lord, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors as those sent out by him to punish those who do what is evil and to praise those who do what is good. For it is God's will that you silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Submit as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as God's slaves. Honor everyone. Love the brothers and sisters. Fear God and honor the emperor. Peter's argument here is something that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, that our responsibility as we interact with government and as we interact with persecution is to remember that God's glory and his praise are the prominent thing that we need to be shooting for. So as we are continuing to work through this series of campaigns in Christianity, remember that that's our goal. As we process public policy, as we process government affairs and politics, we do so with the sole purpose of glorifying God, not just in what we do politically, but also how we do it. So I have been really long-winded the last couple of weeks, and I'm behind in my outline, so forgive me. I'm going to have to skip ahead. But we're going to touch on a couple of brief things, and then tonight we're going to focus primarily on elections. So we are, just to give you a quick background here. So we left off at the executive branch last week. The executive branch, many people know about the president. He serves for a 4-year term. He's got to be 35 years old at least. He's the essentially he's the executor of what the legislature deems appropriate. So here's philosophically how this is supposed to work. The legislature, which is the voice and the mind of the people, says, we want to do this as a nation. So this is the people responding to a situation. They say, we want to do this. The president is supposed to take what the legislature says and do it. That's the primary role of the executive. Now, there are checks and balances in place to where if the legislature tries to abuse their authority, the president can step in and say no, because he's also been elected by the people. Now, something that's important for us to talk about as far as the executive branch goes is the idea of administrative rules or regulations. Many times you'll see politicians running for office and they'll talk about regulations, especially around here. So the reason why that's significant is, so let's take this in little pieces. The Constitution says that we're supposed to have a legislature. They're going to provide these specifics for how we want the community to respond with resources for problems, okay? And so they say, hey, we want to do this. So the executive branch comes in, they receive this bill from the legislature, and they say, okay, well, the legislature says they want us to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. The challenge is the things that the legislature decided to do, they're nuanced. There's things that they didn't know when they were crafting this piece of legislation. And so the executive branch has to have the authority to be able to say, okay, we think we know what you're saying in this legislation, but we need to provide some specifics. And so they provide for the legislature supplementary rules. These are regulations. These are supplementing the statute. So in a perfect world, that would mean that the executive branch and the legislative branch, they get along and they're really working towards the same goal. But we know that doesn't happen because we're all sinful creatures and human beings are bent towards self-destruction. So you have believers in office, you have unbelievers in office, everybody we're dealing with this whole chaos of a sinful situation. So what's happened as the world has become more complex is that the legislature responds to an issue and they pass legislation. So it makes its way all the way through the legislature, gets to the president's desk, he signs it, says, okay, we're going to do this. Well, the executive branch, the bureaucrats who have to actually do what the legislature wants them to do, they've got to actually make the sausage. They've got to follow the recipe. And as the world has gotten more complicated, these bureaucrats have had to take more and more license with what the legislature has asked them to do. So those administrative rules are the same thing that we talk about during elections called regulations. Now, the reason why they are challenging is because they carry the full weight of law. So the executive branch says, we think that you said this, legislature, we are going to do this to help this happen. Well, if the legislature says, no, that's not at all what we meant, they'll challenge them. They'll actually sue the executive branch and they'll let the court figure it out. So the court will adjudicate these differences. Now, I'm going to pull a soapbox out here just for a second, okay? I began to understand this process a little bit more. I had to take a class in college on administrative law. And I began to realize that when we elect a legislator, that's our voice in the process. So as all these decisions are being made, our legislator has the authority as our legal representative to advocate for us. Now, the challenge is that it creates a situation because government, especially in America, is constructed to move slowly, intentionally, because we don't want government to move quickly. Because when government moves quickly, decisions are made based on emotion and based on people's own personal desires and prerogatives, and that causes problems. So we want government to move slowly. That's why we have the whole federalist structure in the first place. Now, as a result, it's pretty obvious that people get frustrated because things don't change. And the change that we do see is stuff that we don't like. And so what do? We say, well, my representative is not doing his job or her job. Kick the bum out of office. And out of frustration, we pass laws that restrict our own voice in the process. So we say, well, if you can't get it done in a certain amount of time, we're just going to make it mandatory that you got to leave office. And so we pass things like term limits. Now, I personally don't like term limits, and let me explain why. So you have the legislative branch over here that is responsible for writing legislation that basically crafts how our community functions, right? And then over here we have these bureaucrats who serve in the administration. Well, there's no term limits for bureaucrats. And so they're working in the system and working in the process their whole careers for 30, 40 years, right? So here's the challenge, is that we limit our voice so that we guarantee to have an ignorant person advocating for us in this process every so many years. So in the state of Oklahoma, we have term limits for 12 years. That means that guaranteed every 12 years, these bureaucrats who are serving in their office, they have no problem at all, but they're negotiating with someone that is always going to be guaranteed to be ignorant every 12 years. What happened as an unintended consequence of term limits in Oklahoma is that all of the institutional knowledge in the legislature was stripped out of the process. And yes, we have legislators who are closer to the people because they're elected more frequently. But the challenge with that, though, is that it's created a political environment in Oklahoma. And let me explain. So you have 12 years to serve in Oklahoma, and I realize I'm giving you some opinion here. So please understand that I'm giving you my personal opinion. So if you have a different view of this, that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to fight you over it. That's perfectly okay. But what I've seen in my experience is that a young man or a young woman gets elected to the legislature, and they serve with their principles and their ideals, and you're going to get them for 4 to 6 years really doing well. And around halfway through their term, they have a decision to make. They can choose to take the noble path, and they can choose to continue to govern the same way for a full 12 years and then leave the legislature. In a perfect world, that happens. The challenge is we don't live in a perfect world. And so what happens is we get 4 to 6 years into their term. Now, by this point, they're a chairman of a committee, and then they have a choice to make. Either they continue to govern the way that they originally said they wanted to, or they begin to realize, you know what, I really enjoy being a part of the process, so that means I need to run for a different office. So if I'm going to run for a different office, whether it's federal Congress or something else, that means that the next decisions that I'm going to make for the next 6 years are going to be a part of that. I'm setting myself up to run for office. So I've got 6 years of campaigns and political decisions made while I'm in office. The other option is there are a lot of former legislators who some of them have great hearts, some of them do not have good hearts at all, who they use those 6 years, since they're serving in a committee that's specific to an industry, to build a network and expertise in that industry so that they can then turn around and they can lobby for that industry in the person that takes their place in the legislature. And as a result, the unintended consequence, from my view, my opinion, is that it diminishes our voice at the Capitol. And it makes things more chaotic. That's just my opinion. So please take that with a grain of salt. But because of the pressures of the administration, I am of the personal opinion that I want my legislator to be the most experienced, most talented, and most knowledgeable person in the room. That's just my opinion. Now, there's a couple of federal things that are unique to Oklahoma. I'm going to do my best to go through this pretty quickly. We're not going to talk about the the legal system. There's too much there to be able to go through. I put a QR code on last week's handout that takes you to a page that will help you find your legislator. Real quickly, one of the things that makes Oklahoma different than other states, there's two primary things. One is that Oklahoma is full of Native Americans. I will spare you the history that got us where we are. But essentially, what happened was that in 1836, President Jackson decides he's going to remove the Indians from the East Coast. He's going to dump them all in one place. So he puts them in Indian territory. At that time, this was just federal land that was governed by U.S. Marshals. Think of Rooster Cogburn, okay? True Grit. That's Indian territory. So the Civil War happens, all the craziness of the Civil War, since this is protected by the federal government. When the Civil War breaks out, all the Union troops, they are pulled out of Oklahoma into the northern states, the northern allied states, which are Kansas and Missouri. They're pulled out of Oklahoma, and as a result, the Confederate Army comes into Oklahoma from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Native Americans, they strike treaties with the Confederate States of America because they have no protection, they've got no weapons, so we might as well negotiate treaties. Then negotiate treaties, the Civil War is over, the federal government comes back in and says, you sided with the enemy. And as a result, in the late 1880s, some of the portions of Indian land, like the Cherokee Strip, which was the Ponca City area, is reallocated from Native Americans and offered up in what is now the famous land run, the 1889 land run. Okay? So, as a result, make our way for another couple of decades. We get to 1906, 1907, around that area. It's like we need to turn this into a state. So they do it. Oklahoma becomes a state in the Union. The challenge is the treaties and the territorial lands that belong to the Native Americans. All of that is federal legislation, not state legislation. So the tribes have relationships with the federal government, not with the state of Oklahoma. So this goes undealt with for 115 years, essentially. So in 2020, there was a decision in the United States Supreme Court called the McGirt decision. And essentially what the McGirt decision found was that essentially, since these things were not dealt with, if you live within tribal boundaries in Oklahoma, and you're a tribal citizen, the state of Oklahoma essentially has no legal authority over you if you're a Native American. So there's a lot of politics around this right now, but the only way that this is going to be fixed is if the federal legislature, the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, if they actually pass legislation to renegotiate these treaties. Because you have an odd relationship between the tribes and the federal government, the tribes and the state government, and the federal government and the state government. You got this triangle of just a dumpster fire. Okay? So within Oklahoma, things are a little murky. And there's a lot we could say about that, but we don't have time tonight. The other thing about Oklahoma that makes this complicated, the reason why I'm saying this is because it ties into your ability to understand what's happening with state. When a guy's running for the state legislature, you need to understand what he actually can deliver on. If someone is running for the state house or the state senate or even for governor, and they say they're going to change federal law or fight the federal government, they are not being completely honest with us. Because the state legislator has no authority with federal regulations whatsoever. So when it comes to tribal issues, that's one of the reasons why Governor Stitt was not able to change the compacts whenever he fought them back in 2020, is because he had no legal authority to do so, as per the arrangements between the tribes and the federal government. Okay, let's move on. There's too much here to miss. So tonight we're going to talk about campaigns, roles in campaigns. So if you have, politics is America's favorite shooting sport. Everybody loves politics for the most part. They love talking about it. They love talking about who's running for office, who's winning, who's losing. I provided you some definitions of different roles of people within campaigns. Obviously, you have the candidate, that's the individual running for office. The way that this typically works is Somebody wants to run for office. They have no idea how the process works, so they have to hire a team of people. So they call the next person that they know that is somewhat politically connected. They start asking questions, and then a professional campaign consultant will come help them. So a campaign consultant is someone who has political connections. They are in the political arena regularly. They know how to raise money. They know how to organize people. They are essentially a professional politicker. Then you have the campaign manager. The campaign manager is someone who is typically a friend of the candidate, or they're not typically a professional, someone who does it for a living. Typically, especially in smaller races like state house and state senate races, this is going to be like your best friend or someone that you trust to go out there and pound the pavement for you. They implement the strategy of the consultant, of the professionals. The finance director is someone who raises money and handles reporting. Anytime somebody runs for office, they have to report to either the state of Oklahoma or to the federal government how much money is coming in to their campaign, who gave them that money, and also how they're spending it. There are regulations about that, about what you can do with that money. And there's limits on how much money people can give personally. So the finance director takes care of all those things. They're the one that handles like fundraisers and logistics for fundraising, things like that. The media director is someone who organizes media appearances. This is not really the case for smaller races like state house or state senate. This position actually can be really beneficial. I was working on a congressional campaign in Oklahoma City in 2014, and we had a media director. He was a former anchor for the Fox affiliate in Oklahoma City. And one of the things I didn't realize at the time, I realize this now, is that reporters are just as busy as everybody else, especially young reporters. Young reporters are just as poor as you were when you were young. And that means that they are doing their best to make a living. And what this gentleman did, his whole business model was that he worked with local reporters to help find them stories. So on the non-political side, he had a list of clients that, you watch the news and you see a story about some legal case happening in the community, and so you have an attorney from the community who's giving commentary on the news and interviewing, those kinds of things. This guy's bread and butter was anytime the news stories needed a professional in an industry, he had those people who retained him, and he would suggest them as guests to be commentators on the stories. This is true not just locally, but this is true nationally as well. There's agents who do this kind of thing. He also would help us with earned media. Earned media is where you're not actually paying for the airtime. So, for instance, in 2014, the guy that we were running for Congress was a military veteran. He was a commander in Iraq in 2003. And so around that time, ISIS was taking over. I don't know if you all remember this, back 2014, 2015. And so a lot of the press was talking about ISIS. We're getting close to the presidential election in 2016. This is becoming an issue. And so our media director was able to call news stations and pitch our candidate as a professional resource. And so he was able to get on Fox and Friends and CNN and a bunch of different other stations, nationwide stations, because of his expertise. So a media director can help position the candidate or personality, whoever it is, to be in those places, because those producers, they're looking for people to be on their shows. And they want to find the best person that's going to draw the most eyeballs. So if you have somebody as a media director, they're able to help facilitate that process. The volunteer coordinator, this is somebody who works with a campaign manager. They organize people to go door knock and make phone calls, things like that. Volunteers are obviously people who donate their time to help the candidate. And then there's donors. Most people focus on donors as in people who give money, but that's not always true. Some people give professional services. So you have traditional donors who actually write a check for money, and then you have other donors who give supplies or things like that. So an example of an in-kind donation would be, say we're going to have a fundraiser, and Terry's going to run for office. Okay? We're just going to pick him because he's awesome. So Terry's running for office. We're going to have a fundraiser for Terry, and so he decides, okay, we're going to have a reception at the McAllister's house, and so people are going to come and they're going to write checks. Well, obviously that comes with the expenses, right? Because we're going to provide food and drinks and things like that. And so we decide, okay, well, we don't have the money to buy the food because we need to raise money. We don't have the money to spend, so we need somebody to provide the food. So we ask Siggy to do it. So Siggy decides, I'm going to in-kind food for Terry's fundraiser. And what happens is, so that means that we're able to put on this event, a good event, it's going to have good food, we're going to have good refreshments, and it's not going to cost the campaign anything. So we have an in-kind donation of food to the campaign. Well, then we have the event itself, and people come and they write checks for the because they're like, oh yes, Terry's our guy, we love him, we're going to support him. So we start writing checks to Terry, right, to his campaign. And because between the in-kind donation of the food and the financial donations from the donors, we have a successful fundraising event. Okay? So both people are considered donors from the political perspective. Okay? So being involved in a campaign doesn't always mean that you just donate money. It could also mean that, hey, I've got a sign business and we're going to give you signs for free. That's going to be an in-kind donation, which can be really helpful. Some campaign basics here. Campaign 101, this is the basic rule. No one will ever vote for someone they've never heard of. So if you have what's called name ID, you are a prime candidate. Because as much as we love to think that we are really involved in the political process, we really have limitations because we're human beings. And we're not as involved as we think we are. Most people don't know who they're going to vote for until they get into the booth to mark their ballot. And so the name ID typically is the thing that you're shooting for. So it doesn't matter how you get name ID, as long as you get name ID, right? We've seen this happen in elections recently where someone is well known, not necessarily because they've got great politics, but because they're just well known. And so people turn out and they vote for them. So if you want to run for office, here's what happens. You file your form for candidacy. You go to the county election board, and they give you a voter list. So if you run for office, you are given a basic list of voters in your district. You know what party they belong to, but really you don't know anything else besides that. So that raw data is mostly useless because I don't know who's actually going to vote and who just is registered. So there's two different kinds of voters. There's registered voters and then there's likely voters. Just because you're registered doesn't mean you're going to go vote. That's the voter turnout percentage that we talk about a lot. Well, the percentage of voters that turned out was X amount. Likely voters are people that we think are going to go to the polls. Okay? So how do I know the difference between the two of them? Well, I'm glad that you asked because there's professionals who actually, their whole business model is taking this data and curating it to where you know who you're talking to. And as a result, it allows you to be able to specifically get the right message to the right people. So how do we get somebody elected? I think there's the slide. Hey, go ahead and go to the next slide. Yes. Okay. So if you get a voter list, this is what it looks like. So on the far left, we've got the name of the voter, voter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Then we have the party that they belong to. So we know, okay, if I'm a Republican and I'm running in a closed Republican primary, that means that only Republicans can vote for me. Democrats don't matter. They don't exist because they can't go to the dance with me anyway, right? If I'm running as a Democrat, I'm going to only talk to the Democrats. Then I have their address. I want to make sure where they live, their gender, okay, if I'm talking to a man or a woman. And you have all this other information, their phone number, their cell phone, voter ID. Now, the far right column, you have the voter propensity. What that means is that's the likelihood of the person to vote. So the way that number is decided is in the last 4 elections, how many times did they vote? In the last 4 elections. So that's the typical cycle is primary election, general election, primary election, general election. So of those 4 elections that were held, how many times did they vote? Okay? So we see on our list here, we see voter number 2 and 3 and voter 6, they voted 4 out of the last 4 elections. So it's a really high likelihood that this person is going to be motivated to vote. So who do I want to talk to first? I want to talk to those people because they're going to turn out. Now, voter number 4, who only has a voter propensity of 1, that means that there's a 25% chance they're going to show up. And if it's a primary, chances are they're not even going to think about it. So they're going to be the very last person that I talk to. So what this allows campaigns to do, it allows them to be able to see, okay, out of this massive list of people, I have X amount that are number 3 voters, X amount that are number 2 voters, and X amount, okay, my 4s. My 4x4 voters, that's the good stuff. That's the cream on the top. So those are the people that I need to go see. What this allows campaign professionals to do is to estimate what voter turnout's going to be. So if I know if there's X amount of 4s and there's X amount of 3s, so it's a 100% for the 4s, 75% for the 3s, 50% for the 2s, 25% for the 1s, as far as who's going to turn out. So I can predict who's going to show up on election day. And so that means that if I know how many people are going to show up on election day, I know how many gets me to 51%. So I just got to go get those people. It's called vote counting. So if I'm counting votes, I'm going through and I'm saying, okay, if I know out of 100 people, if I know that I need 51 of those 100 people, I don't need 100 votes. I need 51 votes. And that's how we win. Okay? So as they're working through this data, what they're doing is they're trying to figure out, okay, who do we need to talk to and how many do we need to get on board? And here's the other part, is that if you're a 4x4 voter, there's a very high likelihood that you're going to bring some people with you on your coattails. So for instance, you've got a husband and a wife. She's a number 4 voter. He's a 2 voter. Really high likelihood that she's going to vote. Well, if she's motivated enough, she's going to get his butt to the polls to vote, right? So that means that I want those 4s on my side because they're going to pull other people into the election with me. And so there's a way for the old phrase, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So what you do when you run for office is you carve up the elephant. How many pieces do I need to win the race? So that's what they're doing. Now, in order to get to that number, in order to get to victory, there's a number of tools that are used. One of the tools that's used is polling. Now, there's a lot of myths about polling, but there's 2 primary tactics about polling, okay? The first kind of polling is scientific polling. Scientific polling focuses on an actual accurate picture of what's happening within the public. So a scientific poll is going to be one that is making sure that the sample size is large enough, making sure that the data is accurate, and making sure that they're talking to the right people. There are people, this is their business. So remember we have this list of voters, right, that we got from the county election board. Well, the people that take that data and they curate it and they work on it and they add stuff to it, what happens is they are working with that data to know what people are talking about, what they're interested in, and they make their money utilizing that data set. So, for instance, if you have a list of phone numbers, but you have no idea who they belong to, and you want to poll those phone numbers, that's great, but I have no idea what the poll means because I have no idea who answered the questions. So a scientific pollster is going to make sure that not only is their data accurate, but also that it's current. Because at the end of the day, they want to have said, I predicted the results. Because if they can say, I predict the results, that means that the next time somebody wants to hire a pollster, they want to hire the guy that knows what they're doing. Okay? So there's a number of ways that these pollsters make money. One is, since they're curating this list, they will sell the list if they want to. They'll sell it to there's legal arrangements to where there's limitations to what they can do or what people can use it for, but they will sell chunks of data. I remember that, can you go back to that slide for me, please, with the graph? Okay, so now consider, this is an Excel spreadsheet. So each of these little bitty boxes, they all contain, think about them as little buckets of information, okay? So let's take voter 1, for instance. Voter 1, we know he's a Republican. We know he lives on Baker Street. We know he's a man. He's a number 2 voter. But imagine these columns, they go all the way to the right to infinity. And there's other things on there, like he has a swimming pool, or he likes dogs. He doesn't like cats. He subscribes to Runner's Magazine. He loves the Second Amendment, but he's also pro-choice. Like, imagine all of this information looks like data as far as your eye can see. Now, each individual row is his social DNA. These are all the things that make up, as a snapshot of one point in time, this is who this person is and this is what they believe. Well, if I have all of this information about somebody and I'm going to send him a flyer in the mail and I know that he's got a swimming pool I know that he loves dogs but doesn't like cats. I know all this stuff about him. What kind of picture am I going to put on that postcard? I mean, I'm probably going to put a picture of him with the dog. I'm going to make sure that the candidate is standing next to a swimming pool, right? I'm going to put all this stuff in that mailer so that when this guy looks at it, he's going to think, man, this guy's just like me, right? Same thing is true for veterans. I love veterans. They're amazing. If you're a veteran, you know that another guy that's running is a veteran, there's a very, very high likelihood that I'm voting for this guy. So when I have the choice, if I'm sending a mailer to veterans and I've got a veteran running for office, if I've got a choice between putting a picture of him in a suit and tie and him in his Marine blues, which picture am I going to choose? The Marine blues. Absolutely. All day long. Because that is who I'm talking to. I had an old client of mine who was a Navy pilot, and he said that he described it as weapon-to-target pairing. For the veterans in the room, you guys know that when you're firing an ordnance at a target, you want to make sure that the ordnance that you're launching is going to penetrate the target. You're not going to shoot a tank with a .22, right? You're going to hit it with something a little bit bigger. So the same thing is true with politics. They're going to take this social DNA, and they're going to try to do weapon-to-target pairing and say, we're going to hit the right voter with the right message, with the right picture to try to motivate them to vote for me. So the pollsters, they rely on accurate data like this. Well, how do they get the data? Well, they do it through things like surveys. You'll get phone calls about things other than politics. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? Used to be that that surveyors would call and they would ask about products, like what cleaning products do you use? What's your favorite TV show? Different things like that. And they've started collecting this data. Well, now they don't have to do that as much because we have these stupid things we carry around with us all the time. And so every time, like, have you ever noticed that you're talking to your spouse about something, and next thing you know, the ads on your Amazon or ads on your Facebook are exactly what you talked about? The one that freaks me out is when I haven't talked to anybody about something and I start to see the ads about it. Like, wait a minute. I've mind melded with something, right? So the general rule of thumb is, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So if you're logged in, I'm not saying this to scare you, this is just the way that the world works. If you're logged into your Google Mail account, or Yahoo, or AOL, or whatever it is, if you're logged into that email address on your browser, and you are shopping, you're reading recipes, you're doing all kinds of things, everything that your eyeballs touch is being curated into a list like this. So that when the time comes to talk to you about what is important to you, they know what that is. And this is just sales. This is marketing, right? So these scientific pollsters, yes, they're asking questions during the election to try to get an accurate view of where the public is, but what they're also doing is that the primary way that they make their money is making sure that they have valid data. So that's what they're doing. A lot of these guys aren't wearing black hats or white hats. They're just making a living. They honestly don't care about what you do in your private time. They just want to make sure that their information is accurate. And then they sell it. Well, and the same thing is true for political candidates. As they curate a list of email lists and stuff, you might get political emails from different people that are asking you for money or asking you to support different things financially. You're on someone's mailing list because you're worth a dollar amount. And sometimes you might get an email from somebody and think, I don't remember subscribing to this list. How did that happen? Well, your data was sold. Somebody who owned this data, who had curated it, sold it to somebody else. I've been the guy, paying for data before when I was doing campaigns. It's a commodity just like anything else. The second type of polling are push polls. Now, push polls they're a political tool. And a push poll is basically, there's a way to ask a question. You remember whenever you were little and like say you wanted to go over to your friend's house to spend the night, and then you'd say, hey, Timmy, why don't you ask your mom if I can come stay over? And then he would come over, or you do the tactic where like you're standing next to each other and then he asks her if you can spend the night. That would be the example of a push poll, right? There's a way to ask a question to get a desired response. So a push poll, as opposed to a scientific poll, these pollsters will write out their questions to a point to where they want their results to be a certain way. And they're using that for political means. So think about, here's another analogy. You probably have seen a football game where the offense gets right up to the goal line, and it's fourth down. They got to make the touchdown. So the running back gets the ball. He runs into that pile of bodies, and he's in there somewhere. And all of a sudden, you start seeing all of the offensive players doing this: touchdown, touchdown, touchdown. We have no idea if he's in the end zone at all. But they're doing this. They're trying to sway the referee to be like, man, did he get across? Did he not? I guess he got across, so yeah, touchdown. Right? That's an illustration of a push-pull. So, like for instance, back in 2016, there were a lot of polls that said that President Trump wasn't going to win. A lot of polls. Why is that? Well, some of them were not being honest, obviously. But then, on the other side too, when people answer poll questions, if they don't believe that the pollster is going to accurately reflect their views, they will lie. They'll lie to the pollster all day long. So you'll have false positives on results. So you might think, man, how in the world can we know what's real and what's not real? That's why websites like Real Clear Politics takes all of the polls and they start averaging them out. That way you can see, oh, that one's an outlier. That one's definitely not it. And as a result, these the pollsters are held accountable because they don't want to be too far out there. So push polls are something. So the next time that you see a poll or somebody says, yeah, this race is interesting, who's ahead in the polls, understand that you're not talking about pure science. There's a political agenda. Now there's some pollsters who are mercenaries. They'll just do whatever. And you give them garbage data, they'll make the poll say whatever you want, and then they'll say, oh no, well so-and-so, the polls show that they're so far ahead, you might as well not even show up. That's a thing too. So take polls with a grain of salt. Now, political parties, the way that they're organized differently, if you're running within a party structure to serve in an elected body, every party is different. So every party has rules about how you can represent that party in the legislature or city council or whatever. So you got to play according to those rules. I'll give you an example. If you are, for instance, if you're running for president under the Republican ticket, the Republicans have decided, so each state Republican Party decides how they're going to break up their delegates. So every state has a number of delegates. They all decide, have their primaries. We're in the middle of that right now. All the states are deciding who they're going to vote for. They have their primaries. And every state decides if some of them are all or nothing states where they get all the delegates. Some of them break them up by percentage. And after all that's said and done, all those delegates from all over the country, they get together in one central place for a national convention, and then those delegates, they cast their vote based on what their state has decided. So in 2016, I was a delegate in Cleveland, Ohio, for the state of Oklahoma for the Republican Party. And my responsibility was to go to represent Oklahoma. Now, if you're on the Democrat side, they have regular delegates and then they have superdelegates. They control, essentially a superdelegate has more, their vote is weighted more than a traditional delegate. It's a way for them to be able to control who gets nominations, okay? Which seems really undemocratic to me, but I digress. But within the political parties, they're all broken up. You have local clubs, you have county parties, state parties, national parties. There's a difference between federal campaigns and state campaigns. State campaigns obviously are dealing with state issues. So if you're running for the Oklahoma House of Representatives or the Oklahoma Senate, you are representing a portion of Oklahoma in the state legislature. If you're running for the United States Congress or the United States Senate, you are running for a federal office. And there are different things. There is never mind, we don't have time to get into that. Campaign tactics, you will find people that will, people will send mail, they'll put signs out, they'll make phone calls, they'll do social media posts, they'll do traditional media, they'll do all kinds of things. And the whole goal of all of this is to raise name ID. The more name ID we have, the better it is, right? Because nobody's going to vote for somebody they haven't heard of. And if you're banking on that yard sign to cast a vote for you, you got to talk to a person, right? all that stuff just serves to raise name ID. There's two constituencies within every election. One is the actual voters themselves, and then there's the stakeholders. Let me explain that. So let's see a good example. Okay, let's use Oologah, Oklahoma. Okay, so Oologah, where my bride graduated high school, go Mustangs. They've got a coal-powered fire plant about a couple miles from the school, which at one time paid a lot of ad valorem property taxes. Okay, so the state representative from Oologah, for instance, back at that time in history, about 20 years ago, he had to make sure that the voters elected him, but he also had to make sure that PSO liked him as well, because we're talking about a major employer, a major constituency within his district, right? So he has to walk a fine line between, okay, what does the power company want and what does my constituency want? And hopefully it's the same thing where they're working together. That's true for every race, no matter what it is. So, for instance, in Tulsa, we have a lot of aerospace here with the American Airlines plant, right? Largest commercial aeronautics maintenance facility in the world. And so there's a lot of aerospace interests in Tulsa. So that means that not only does our federal congressman and our United States senator care about American Airlines and care about aerospace, but so do the however many hundreds of people that work at American Airlines and all of their other connected companies. So whenever you see someone running for office and it says, well, this company, they gave them all this money to run for office for this thing or whatever, there may be a reason why a company is supporting a specific candidate, because their livelihood is at stake with how the decisions are made. Okay, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be, but not necessarily a bad thing. So you have voters, and then you have stakeholders. And then you have, so there's cycles of a campaign. In Oklahoma, you have to have 51% or over 50% of the vote. So if you're in a crowded primary, so say for instance, I've got 10 people running for an office, it's an open office, and you got to have over 50% to get the nomination to run in the general election. Well, Genghis Khan can run and get 5% of the vote, right? So let's say that we have 9 of those guys who get 5%. Well, okay, now we're at 45%. Say one of them, say we start distributing that even more, each one gets 10%, we're not going to get anywhere close. So in order to have a victor, we have runoff elections. So we have the initial primary, and the top 2 vote getters, they run again in another election cycle for a runoff election. Once the runoff election, they decide, okay, who the nominee is going to be. Once that's decided, then we have the general election. Now, here's why this matters. This is way inside baseball. You probably don't care about this at all. But from the campaign's perspective, every election cycle, it is the potential to, so people are limited to how much money that they can give in campaigns in Oklahoma. On the federal side, they've raised it recently. It's $3,300 per person. So if you're a married couple and you really like a guy running for office, for federal office, you can only give $6,600. Only, I say you can only give. The maximum you can give is $6,600. Okay? Now for some folks, that's not a whole lot of money, but for a lot of people, that is a lot of money. But in states like Missouri, there's no cap. So say I want to run for office, and I say, hey, Paul, I want to run for office. And he says, okay, he writes me a check for $500,000. He can do that in Missouri. He can't do that in Oklahoma. So the reason why these cycles are important is that every time that there's a new election cycle, that refreshes itself. Okay? So if I have donors who have a lot of financial resources, and they max out to my campaign in the primary, and I make it into the runoff, they can write another check. Boom, another $6,600. Because remember, if you remember my first talk, dollars in a campaign are the same as bullets in a war. It doesn't mean that you're going to win, but it does give you a higher likelihood. It gives you more ammunition, okay? So they can write another check for the runoff, and then they can write another check for the general. So that's significant for campaigns, because what that means is that gives me resources to be able to get my name ID up and to advertise and to do those types of things. The cycles are also important because it also indicates momentum. So as the cycles roll through, a lot of times, this is kind of an oddity, typically the person who wins a primary and gets into a runoff, the number one person, usually they don't win. Because usually the person that came in second to get into the runoff, everybody else who lost to the number one guy, they're all hacked off, and they're like, forget that guy, I'm going with number two. And so typically number two will win in a runoff. You have special interest groups. These are folks who they're connected to an issue or to an industry. Special interest groups they're a two-edged sword, because you have organizations like the National Right to Life, who they advocate for pro-life causes on a federal and state level. And so they make a number of different, they can make contributions in a couple of different ways. One is that special interest groups can endorse a candidate. Sometimes you'll see that during elections. You'll say, so-and-so just got endorsed by this organization. And essentially what that means is that organization is going to use their network or their connections to be able to help facilitate that person to run for office. In the old school days, like if you got the endorsement of certain organizations, they mandated every single person in that organization was going to vote for you, early and often, right? And so that was a big deal, especially a few hundred years ago. So they can endorse you, but secondly, especially now, what happens is special interests will contribute money directly to a campaign. The limit is $5,000. Or they will turn around and they will buy media for you, for your campaign. And the way that the law works is that you can't communicate between the two of them, but it's kind of a murky thing that's not really enforced very well. So here's a potential situation. I'm running out of time. So Terry's running for office, right? We love that. You're doing a great job, Terry. So Paul, his benevolent benefactor, who has all of the money, he decides he's going to help Terry out because Terry is cash-strapped in his campaign. His donors are maxed out. They can't give any more money because of limitations. He's struggling to raise resources to be able to keep boots on the ground and buy more signs and get more phone calls made and get out in the public. And so Paul decides he's gonna write a check and he's gonna fund a special interest group, and they're gonna run campaign ads for Terry. So they can't use official campaign material, but if they have a photographer at events that Terry's at, they can use those photos. Or if, I don't know, there's just pictures of Terry on the internet, or maybe short clips of videos on random things in his public use, they can use that too. So what'll happen is, oh my goodness. So before the independent expenditure happens, sometimes, a lot of times, there will be a lot of video footage shot and a lot of pictures taken before this is actually an official thing, because once this is an official thing, there can't be any collusion whatsoever. So there's a bunch of random videos of Terry running in the neighborhood, or he's got his blue-collared shirt on, rolled up 2/3 of the way, randomly pointing at things at a job site with strangers he doesn't know, or he's talking to random old people, or he's talking to little children that he doesn't know who they are. These little videos, all of a sudden, they're up on the internet. And that means that this independent expenditure can go grab all that media, and we can produce videos with Terry in them that we got to say at the end of the video, not authorized by any candidate or candidate committee. But really, it's a way for Paul to help Terry to get around these contribution limits. Okay? So that's true not just in that situation, but also with others. So there are legitimate issues that require influence, and sometimes, a lot of times that happens. So it's not just for candidates, but also for campaigns. I was involved in a campaign goodness, 9 years ago, that would have ended abortion in Oklahoma, and we had some powerful friends that ran ads for us for that campaign. Got it through the legislature, and the governor vetoed it after she promised that she would sign it. So that was fun. There are, let's see. Okay, I've got about 5 minutes. So the final thing is, so how do you get involved in a campaign? Say, for instance, you feel strongly about an issue or about a candidate or a person, or you want to get involved. That's how I got involved in politics, is that I felt compelled to participate. And so I started going to meetings, started meeting strangers, and I started to get involved. And I started out knocking doors. I still remember I pulled out making phone calls from my house in Claremore, and I had one of those Excel spreadsheets and had all these names. Okay, call these people and see who they're going to vote for. Counting votes. So I call the first number. I'm like, okay, really nervous. Okay, hey, thank you, ma'am. Hang up. And I called the next number on the list. But I didn't realize there was the same number only for the person's husband, for the lady's husband. And so I called the exact same number back, and I said, hi, this is Philip Jackson from so-and-so's campaign. And she probably could tell that I was a young person. I was, 24, 25 years old. And she goes, honey, you just called me. Oh, ma'am, you're right. I'm so sorry. And so I hung up. But how do you get involved in a campaign, right? So I remember the key thing is just to ask questions from people who are already involved and to just show up. There are party meetings, the club meetings, there's all kinds of things you can go to, lunches that you can learn great information from and meet legislators and different elected officials. But for those of you who are thinking, okay, what does this mean to me? Why does this even matter? Like, obviously, I can't get somebody elected president. I'm just me. I want to tell you a story. So when I was in college doing my undergraduate work at Rogers State, I got involved in student government. I had the mindset when I went back to school the first time that if I could learn anything about government, I would do it. So that meant I got involved in everything, fighting for free speech on campus. We got some administrators fired. It was a great time. But one of my friends, who was a freshman at the time, she decided she wanted to run for student government president. And that was a significant thing because at the time, the Student Government Association at Rogers State, they allocated about $35,000 or $40,000 to student organizations over the course of a year. So we're talking about a lot of money. And what had happened was, as Greek life had begun to be introduced into the school, it's a relatively young school, the fraternities and sororities had essentially gotten elected to all these offices in the Student Government Association, and then anytime that there was a vote for funds, they could run the table. And so we're government geeks. I had a wife and 2 children. I'm not part of a fraternity. That's fine. If people are, that's great. But that wasn't my cup of tea. But anyway, so my friend decides she wants to run for office. So like, okay, you should do it. Adrian, you should do it. She's a little person. She's like this tall. And little, 19-year-old from Nowata. And right down the little road from Ulugai. So we start doing it. We start talking to people and putting out flyers, and, chalking the sidewalks and all the things. And election day comes, and hey, you should vote for Adrian. Vote for Adrian. So come, and we're getting everybody in the polls or whatever. And then we have the banquet. Banquet is when they announce who the winner is, and you have all the pretty people up front, everybody who's involved, and they're all having a great time, and all of us geeks are in the back at the same table. There's 4 or 5 of us. And so the president at the time, she got up and she said, well, time for us to announce the winner of the election. And she was running against another guy, smart, brilliant, doing pre-med, going to go to medical school, be a doctor. And man, he looked sharp. He had his suit on, tie was all good, hair was nice, like everything. And he was ready for his moment. And the outgoing president said, well, we counted the votes twice. And by a difference of 1 vote, the winner is Adrian Shelley. we lost our minds. We're like, what, are you serious? And of course the president got to pick their cabinet, and so all of us, get to be in office and all this stuff. And I feel like we did a lot of good things there. But I'll never forget that lesson, because I realized that America is the most incredible place in the history of the world, because anybody can do anything. And part of what God has shown me in how all of this works together, our heritage of faith, how we participate in the process, how we interact with our government, we're in a different scenario than our forebears are, because our Christian heritage has been interacting with government from the beginning, has been understanding that institutions are established by God, and that since we serve the living God and He's the one that's establishing these institutions, we have a role to play in them. And if there are pagan people who don't understand this and aren't believers in Jesus Christ, who are in places of authority, we need to understand that God has put them there on purpose. The world is still full of Nebuchadnezzars. It's still full of Cyruses. It's still full of all of these pagan rulers. And yet, God goes out of His way to make sure that His people always are in a position to glorify Him and how they interact with those power structures. So as we navigate all of the politics of 2024, the presidential election, the conventions that are coming up, all of the things that are going to be said about everybody, I want to just remind you gently that how we engage in the process is just as important as the outcome. Because not only is the world watching, but as folks who take their faith seriously, others are watching us, because how we conduct ourselves in the public square gives them permission, especially if they are younger believers that don't understand everything that we understand. How we conduct ourselves gives them permission to act in a way that we act. So if we conduct ourselves in ways that are disrespectful, that don't bring glory to the Lord, that we don't walk worthy of the calling of Christ, if we don't understand that there's two audiences, there's the powers that be and the public square, if we neglect that, we do so not only at our own peril, but at the peril of the glory of God. And I don't know about you, but when I get to heaven, I want our Father to be joyful in how He describes how I have stewarded His name and reputation in my nation and in my generation. And recognize that we stand in a long line, a heritage of faith that has been bringing glory to God since the beginning. So how we interact with government, how we run our campaigns, how we involve ourselves in the political structure, there are eternal rewards and eternal consequences. So my prayer for you is that as you engage in the political world, that you would bring glory to God, that you would bring glory to Evergreen, and that you would conduct yourselves in a way that is worthy of the calling. Let me pray for us, and we'll go. Father, thank you. Thank you for tonight, for the ability to be able to be in this building, to open your word and talk about our nation and our state. Lord, I ask that you would give us wisdom as we navigate the politics of this year. Pray that you would draw us to yourself and that you would give us courage to be honest about the decisions that we make. And Lord, as our country continues to spiral towards hedonism and pagan worship, Father, I pray that you would give us courage to speak the truth in love, but to not compromise our morals. Lord, give us wisdom and boldness to live the truth and to speak it in love. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you all.